I mean, the most painful experience that I have had in poker in my life was...
Welcome Poker Life. Next question, Crispin. Are tournament poker players better than cash players?
Are we talking professionally or recreationally?
Professionally.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a firm stance on this age-old debate and say it depends. It depends because they require different skill sets to a degree. Obviously, both are going to be superb at poker. A top-tier MTT tournament professional with a long record of wins behind them is going to be a fantastic poker player in every area. But there is a degree of specialization and skills that need to be developed to be better at one or the other. In the case of cash games, the technical precision is going to be greater because it's easier to study spots that don't change very much. Everyone buys in deep in a cash game, and it's easier to know the range of bet sizings and flop actions when you've got a button versus big blind, normal open, single raise pot with standard blinds that don't change. You can study that spot deeply and understand all the different possible outcomes of the decision tree and the relative EVs of each one. So from that, you gain a degree of understanding of the concepts of poker. Why, for example, the solver will take a certain action that you don't see very often, and you can delve into that node and understand the theory behind something that seems counterintuitive. And from that, you get an essence of poker, an understanding of poker that you don't normally get in most tournament games.
Is GT game theory optimal have a play in this?
Absolutely. That's the way a solver will play, right? If you enter, for example, a button range versus a big blind range, both sides will play optimally, and you will find what the appropriate action and counteraction is for each one to be unexploitable, and the relative EVs of each decision. And if you do an investigation, explore it in detail, do some proper study, then you will get insight into the way poker works. And so cash game poker, because of its static nature, makes it a more high technical exercise.
Sure.
And a bit like chess, the board, whenever you sit down at a chess game, it's going to be the same number of pieces. The board is going to start out the same way with the same position. And so when you study an opening, you are studying something that anybody can study, and you will experience every time you sit down and play a game of chess. So for that reason, because cash game poker is so similar with deep stacks and even blind structures, there is going to be a degree of depth of analysis that is greater than most tournament spots. Because in tournaments, the game is changing constantly. Blinds are getting shallower. You've got different stack sizes at the table, which are radically different and interplay with one another in multiple ways. And it's going to be very difficult to take one spot and replicate that across the entire tournament, right? You obviously get experience and you can study individual spots. You know what to do with the 25 big blind stack, 10 spots from the bubble or something like that. But it's going to be unique to that spot. There are multiple stages of the tournament, and each stage has its own technical aspect, which is going to be very difficult for a human to master because we don't see all spots all of the time in a tournament. Things change too rapidly. So because of the static nature of cash games, people can study that deeply. People can really get into the underlying core essence of the game in a way that in tournaments, it's hard for a human being to do that because it just requires too much study.
Okay, so why tournament players so good at poker?
Well, what makes tournament players fantastic is they still have an element of that. Of course, they're going to do a lot of study. And one of the things that is advantageous in tournaments is that if you do the technical study, it's quite often the case that your opponents won't. Right? Because in a cash game, everyone can study the same thing. Whereas in tournaments, you could focus on a particular thing and really get an understanding of that particular aspect of the game tree, which is something that your opponents will not be as familiar with, which gives you an advantage. But there are other skills in tournaments that I think are more compelling overall. One is tournament players have better endurance. I know this is like a soft skill, but when you sit down at a cash table, the advantage of sitting down at a cash table is you can get up and leave whenever you want. You want to take a break, even if you have to pay a blind or something, it's not a big deal, and you can go and have a drink and meal. Whereas if you take 20 minutes out of your tournament to go have a meal, then you could
bust out.
Yeah, you could really suffer in your position at the tournament, right? So you can't afford to do that. You have to wait for the breaks, which can be really long between times, and the breaks aren't necessarily particularly long. And when you get your buy-in and you've paid to sit down at a tournament, you're there for the long haul. You're there until hopefully the final table and winning the tournament. That can be hours and days to achieve. So
because you're wide open field, there's hundreds and hundreds of players going through multiple days to even get through the next stage.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many opportunities just to punt off your stack and be out. Like, it's so easy to do, particularly in a tournament where stacks are so shallow. And therefore, you might have a nice 35 big blind stack, which is reasonably healthy in a tournament, and just be out straight away because you've just made a slight error. So the degree of focus that tournaments require, endurance, energy, concentration, those innate skills and patience is greater in tournaments than they are in cash games. Because in cash games, you can just take a break. And so because of that fact, you don't need to build up those endurance muscles. And also psychologically, cash games, I think, are a little bit easier. First of all, cash game downswings don't last as long, typically, because cash is inherently less variance. And you can go 25, 30 buy-in tournament downswings just completely not even call that a downswing. The people would argue that 25 buy-ins isn't even classified as a downswing in tournaments because the variance is just so much greater. And to get to the long term is much harder. It requires a lot more volume. And therefore, the soft skill of stoicism, of maintaining emotional balance, to not kind of go completely off the rails, go off tilt, to maintain healthy bankroll management, all of those things, tournament players, in order to be successful, in order to be winning professionals, need to be better at than cash game players. Because cash game players can be like, I've got X number of buy-ins in my bankroll, I'm going to play stakes that are suitable for that bankroll. They can move up and down nice and easily. Whereas tournament players, they might have some big trade-offs to make in terms of, okay, I could get this big payoff tournament, but then I could play these smaller satellites and get more for my money. That's a big challenge to do well.
It's a big time sink too.
Oh, absolutely. There is nothing more painful than, the most painful experience that I have had in poker in my life was being the stone bubble. Right, which obviously is the bubble, of course, is the last person to bust out of a tournament and not make the money. Where the hand before I bubbled, I was second in chips in the whole tournament. I got stuck in a hand where I didn't need to do it. I absolutely didn't need to do it. The big stack of the tournament just happened to be sitting next to me. We'd been chatting, for days on it. It was fine. We got to know each other well. And I flopped an open-ended straight flush draw, turn top pair. River was a brick, and we got all the money in on the turn, and that was it. It was just a very and it was purely because I was so tired. And in a cash game, it would have been a no-brainer to play the hand exactly the way I played it, because if you bust, you 3-buy. In cash games, we don't have ICM. So if you've got 51% equity in a hand, you put all the money in because there's a 1% edge that you're going to make money. And if you do that 1,000 times, well, you're going to make a profit. Whereas in a tournament, you've got to weigh in all the other considerations as to how much my stack is worth if I bust, which is 0. And how much it's worth right now just to fold this hand and make it into the money, which of course was the correct decision. So these are things that tournament players have to intuit the whole time and be mindful of. So they've got to be aware of a lot more things going on. So it's not only that they have to be at the table a lot longer, which they do, but they have to be mindful of the changing dynamics much more. People are coming and going from the table much more because as people bust out, they rebalance the tables, they move people around. And they've got to be aware of the ICM implications of any decision. It's not just, one chip is worth X. That chip that is worth different amounts depending on how big your stack size is and what stage of the tournament you're in. So for that reason, I think professional tournament players are more well-rounded as poker players in terms of their innate skills. Of course, they study relentlessly to make sure that they do the right thing in difficult and common spots. But from a technical point of view, if you do ask who is the better chess player, which is much easier to kind of measure, we have ELOs, then cash game players are going to be better.
It's like the cash player is book smart, but the tournament player is like street smart because there's so many other variables at you.
Yes.
And has to adapt as they go.
Absolutely. Now, there are people that are going to bitterly disagree and say that tournament players are technically more proficient because they've got to study more different spots. And people will say cash game players need more endurance because their opponents can adjust more rapidly. These are all valid arguments. Just from my experience, and ultimately this is a matter of opinion, technically cash game players are going to be better, and overall well-roundedness, tournament players are going to be better. Another thing that makes tournament players have a bit of an easier time is that the fields on average are a bit weaker. So if you're in a massive open field tournament, you'll have a higher proportion of recreational players than if you're playing a high stakes cash game, for example. There'll still be recreational players in high stakes cash, of course, but for example, the World Series of Poker main event, it's $10,000 US buy-in tournament. Now, $10,000 US in a cash game is a big game, right? You sit down and you're playing a fairly high stakes game, and there aren't going to be that many people in that game who don't play poker seriously, okay? Whereas the World Series, you've got celebrities, you've got business people, you've got people on their bucks parties and things. They're going to the World Series of Poker for the event of being there. They don't seriously think they're going to win. They're just there because it's a prestigious event that's celebrated and they can show that they've got the money to buy in. And so it's a very lucrative tournament for professionals to play. And so it's just that kind of potential return on investment is higher in tournaments, but it requires a commensurate degree of energy and time. Okay, just to round this off, you are not going to be a successful tournament player if you can't go from 50 big blinds down to 10 big blinds in a single hand because you got unlucky, and then the next hand you bust because you punt off the remaining 10 big blinds, when instead you should be quickly recentering yourself, playing your stack appropriately, and try to fight your way back into the tournament. Don't worry about your bad beats or your mistakes, and just play the tournament from there with the patience of forgetting about what had previously happened and focusing from that point forward. That's a very difficult thing to do in a tournament. In a cash game, it's easier because you can buy your stack back up to whatever it is that you think is healthy and generally get back into the habit a bit quicker. Whereas in the tournament, you have to play from the point that you now are at. And that is psychologically a real challenge for a lot of people. And to be able to fight your way back from being, on fumes to something healthy is the hallmark of a winning, successful tournament player. And that's not a technical skill. That is a mental skill. And so I think in that sense, tournament players are more intuitive. And then conversely, like cash game players would hit back and say, once you get to small stack sizes, a lot of it becomes luck. You're shoving your 10 big blinds in the middle, you're hoping the hand holds up. Whereas because post-flop play is the hallmark of cash game, you've got to mentally be able to outplay your opponents post-flop and use your depth of skill where you've got an edge to take them to parts of the game tree that they're not familiar with. So cash game players would have their arguments too. In other words, it is a matter of opinion. Personally, technical specifics, cash, mental game, tournaments. That's my view.
So bring it back to you guys. Who is the better poker player? Cash game players or tournament players? Are the skills different, or is there any difference at all? Leave your comments and thoughts down below, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye for now.